Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I'm very honored today to be joined by Dr. Samir Puri, whose new book, Westlessness, looks at the kind of the future almost of the West's role in international relations and world power. And the idea that it may not be the kind of the hegemonic force that it has been in the last 100 years. Kind of roughly paraphrase, I'm sure somebody will be able to give us a much better kind of interpretation of that. But firstly, Samir, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you today. And let us begin. So perhaps you can talk us a bit through the kind of the general thesis of the book and what it is that you've kind of explored there.
Yeah, well, listen, Nick, thank you very much for having me. Really pleased to be able to talk about Westlessness. It's
Mhm.
the Great Global Rebalancing. That's the subtitle. And I think that's a good launchpad for describing what the thesis is about. I am absolutely not sensationalist about this. I don't think the West is going to collapse, nor do I think that the West is the root of all the world's evils. And I think sometimes when this delicate subject is approached, there's a temptation for some writers to verge in either of these directions, to either be melodramatic and say, listen, this is going to be like the end of the Planet of the Apes film from the 1960s, where the Statue of Liberty is half buried in sand and Western civilization comes to an end. Or this is about score settling, and this is about all the West's grand hypocrisies and ills throughout history, which evidently have happened. But my thesis is really about rebalancing influence. And it's in that sort of little invented title, Westlessness. The key syllable is less. And it's about how, as students of history, as I'm sure we all are listening to a podcast like this, and me certainly writing a book like this, it's about how the future is going to be very, very different to all of the history that everybody alive today remembers regarding the centrality of the West. But frankly, also, if you are to put a historical chronology on this, which we can a bit later on, it's about 250 odd years, quarter of a millennia, in which different incarnations of the West, the Western Europeans, and of course the North Americans, have had a really dominating influence over other parts of the world. Not necessarily for good or ill, that's really a matter of perspective and of context and of situation. But the flow of influence has been rather more unidirectional,
Mhm.
West influencing others, than it has been the other way, others influencing the West. And last sort of comment on my thesis is, Nick, one of the things that I hope is quite unique about this book is you'll probably tell from my accent that I'm from the United Kingdom. You'll probably tell from my name that my heritage is actually from India. My family came via East Africa. And I'm recording this podcast from Singapore, where I've been based for the last few years. And it really is about fusing a diversity of perspectives on
Yeah.
this really critical issue of how the West is changing and what that will look like in the future.
Okay. Okay. And so if we were to look at that, in what ways is the West changing? And how has it changed?
So I'll start with the latter because, 250 odd years, 300 years, the West itself has gone through so many different incarnations that as I was in the historical parts of the book putting this all together, it's very simple, I think, for us to say, well, there's an era of European-led colonization, and then there's an era of US-led globalization. And, we can draw the lines as to where that overlaps you know, as Brits, we know very well about the War of 1812. We know very well about the rise of America after its own civil war in the mid 19th century. We understand there's a passing of the torch between Pax Britannica and Pax Americana at some point in the 20th century. We get that. So we know that the West itself has changed. We know the influence of France, the formation of Canada, the spread of the Anglosphere to the Australasia. We understand colonization of Indonesia by the Dutch. All of these historical episodes uh, they don't really bear down on the way the US has led the West in the last sort of 50 years or so directly. But the US's leadership of the West directly builds on that prior European colonial era. And the Americans, of course, have their own understandable interpretation of what colonization was and why it was an evil that was kicked out in the 1770s, 1780s from North America. But I think where the West is changing now is that so many of the formerly colonized nations, often colonized by Europeans, whether it's India or Indonesia, parts of sub-Saharan
Mhm.
Africa, but also colonized by the Americans, thinking about the Philippines, colonized by the Japanese, thinking about Korea, or and of course Japan was then occupied by the US after World War II in the 1950s, before it actually then develops its momentum
Mhm.
into the Japan we know today. What we're talking about with this book is looking at that grand arc of history, all of these events that we can place on a timeline, and saying, as these formerly colonized non-Western countries become more independently powerful economically, militarily, maybe even culturally,
Mhm.
how will the world change? How will the world of the future, which we can't predict with any specificity, but we can draw the trend lines. What will those trend lines look like? And so the last sort of takeaway for this, especially for Western audiences, is how will those changes bear back on the West itself and change all of us, whether we're
Mhm.
in Europe or North America?
And there is, I mean, perhaps this has been ongoing for about 100 years, I would guess, but there are anxieties in Western countries almost continually about declinism. Um, if you look at, I mean, there's a huge literature, some of it kind of quite sort of fascistic, people like kind of Spengler and things like that about kind of almost sort of cultural and sort of in the 1920s, this idea of racial decline. And in Britain in the 1920s, there was this idea that it was more kind of a class-based idea that unless the good bourgeois had more babies, the kind of the plebs would reproduce and overtake them. Obviously, it's really quite unpleasant stuff. But um, it seems to be the idea of declinism in wealthy Western countries seems to be a recurrent theme throughout kind of most of modernity. And I wonder what's different about now, would you say?
I'm so glad you mentioned demographics because I break this down into about a dozen or more uh, trends and subfields that we can actually study this with precision. This is my book is actually about breaking all this down rather than having a general anxiety. What is actually happening? What can we measure? Demographics is one part. There's a chapter on it, and I'm so glad you mentioned Spengler because he makes an appearance. You can't write a book about this without Oswald Spengler,
No.
100 or so years after the decline of Western civilization, parts one and two, being referenced, because I do have a chapter entitled Status Anxiety.
Mm.
And that's obvious. And listen, if you're number one tennis player in the world, world champions in football or the NFL, no matter who is the winner in whatever the contest, you will feel the anxiety of the challengers coming.
Yeah.
That is just a law of life. And I think in international affairs and in civilizational success, in the success of what we previously called empires, now what we call, especially in the West, we talk about voluntary clubs like the G7, the EU, NATO, they're voluntary clubs. Whatever your club and your organization, you are now looking over your shoulders uh, quite regularly at China. You're looking at the resurgence of Russia, which interestingly, historically, I trace this. When did Russia not define itself as Western? It is ultimately ethnically sort of Christian white, as many of its rival principalities were in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, but it diverged for
Mm.
reasons that I think for a different conversation. But you're looking as well at countries that aren't even your enemies, like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey renamed itself in 2022 to shed its
Mm.
Latinized name formulation, which it picked up 100 years ago when the West truly ruled. So that's an interesting indicator of something quite trivial, but
Yeah.
it is happening. Countries renaming themselves so they don't need to be as translatable to English. And you're looking at countries like India and Indonesia. No one alive today can predict what those countries' geopolitical alignments will be 40 or 50 years in the future. So to sum all that up, of course, there's status anxiety, there's anxieties in the West, and they're not ill-founded. They are worth dwelling on, and I dwell on them from a historical and contemporary perspective in this book. But also because we don't know how the world is going to play out. I can't write a book and tell you what the world will be like in 20 years. I'd
No.
be a crackpot. I'd be accused of being one rightfully so because we don't have crystal balls. But what we can do is we can say that we are living in an era of transition. Those transitions are starting to become more tangible. They're coming at us a bit more thick and fast. And let's have a sensible discussion about this that really is what the book wants to do, is to provide that scaffolding to the reader to think about these themes in ways that are most pertinent to them, and to do the sort of the predictive thinking that they think is really needed for the specific areas of
Hmm.
life or the world that interest them.
I guess if another kind of stepping stone from sort of between Oswald Spengler and now would be kind of in the 1990s Francis Fukuyama, who perhaps maybe wrote the completely, he wrote this kind of perhaps a misunderstood or kind of overtly maligned thesis now, the idea that really history was all over bar the shouting, and that kind of the Western model of history of liberal democracies and free market capitalism would sweep the world, and everything there would be things that would happen. But the big arguments about whether Soviet communism or fascism or what have you was going to win, that's all over. And he's been a bit kind of sheepish about this particularly after 9/11 and then after 2008. And I think now he sort of says, well, it is all a lot more complicated than that. But is somehow our idea about Westlessness now shaped by that kind of rather triumphalist moment of the 1990s where, hurrah, we've won, was kind of uh, the dominant theme?
Certainly for people of our generation, Fukuyama is incredibly influential. He wrote that first essay of The End of History and The Last Man, actually, I think in the late 80s. And
Mm-hmm.
he then got a book contract. He left his job at the State Department to write his book. And I've always actually been a big fan of Fukuyama. He worked at RAND, the RAND Corporation. That's my first ever job. He then worked in the State Department. I worked in the UK Foreign Office. And I think, I had, and also The End of History, the actual book from the early 90s. Okay, of course, the thesis is wrong, and he admits that now. But I love the way he does it. He uses Marxism, the Marxist dialectic, to deconstruct the way in which the communist systems have become uncompetitive, which was a correct thesis. Of course, his predictive thesis was wrong, and there's a lot of articles now that say the return of history
Mm-hmm.
to argue against him. But a couple of things on this. One is that for our generation, yes, Fukuyama is a really important reference point for intellectually encapsulating that moment of triumphalism at the end of the Cold War. But Fukuyama is writing this as someone who is writing at the 250 odd years into Western power and dominance being the dominant force in the world. And again, there's that, I think the danger in the US, I think, is to see maybe a big break in 1776 and 1783, the Treaty of Paris and the formation of the USA officially. And to, I think, maybe discount the fact that the USA's global success has totally built upon prior European imperial success, not because it agrees with it or perpetuated its sins, but because without it, there would have been no British bases to take over in the 1950s. There'd been no British Diego Garcia. There would have been no, and this was a disaster, of course, no French-led war in Indochina in the 50s to take the strain of, to then fight to defend South Vietnam, and so on and so forth. There was a transition within the Western world between the Europeans and the North Americans. But the rest of the world, Nick, this is the interesting thing, the rest of the world in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and these are the perspectives I do want to bring, do not obsess over this break between the Western Europeans and the US. What they see is 300 years of Western-led influencing of their societies in different incarnations. One quick quote from Kevin Rudd, the former he's now Australia's ambassador to the US, wrote a great book called The Avoidable War. He talked about China, he's a sinologist, he speaks Mandarin. He
Yes.
talks about Chinese perspectives from the age of opium to the age of apple, drawing a line between China's century of humiliation at British hands and the seizure of Hong Kong to the importation of Steve Jobs's and Tim Cook's great brainchild products.
Mm.
That to me, as a Brit, is a line of continuity. If you're Chinese, that is not a ridiculous thing to say that, well, once the British came with warships, now the Americans are trying to hem us in with warships. And that's the key, I think, takeaway from this particular response, Nick, is that it's about perspective.
Yeah.
And the more in the West that Westerners can do to understand other people's perspectives without having finger pointing and blame, the
Hmm.
better equipped we're going to be for this century.
Oh, I mean, it's a broad statement, but I think historically we're pretty terrible at that. I mean, if you look at how Mao saw the world from the kind of the 1940s onwards, he saw a kind of a string of islands on his coast that were, dominated by imperialists. He saw in the 1950s a colonial war on his southern border in Vietnam. Um, and then he has a hostile Russia in the other direction, grow gradually throughout the kind of the 50s and the 50s and 60s. And this sense of being surrounded by enemies. This isn't something. I mean, when the Americans talked about domino theory, they were primarily talking about Maoism as opposed to Soviet communism and containing it. Um, and Mao said, "Well, look what they did to Russia after 1918. You know, there were counter-revolutionary incursions and invasions and all that sort of stuff. You got to watch these capitalist powers." And I think, as you said, right or wrong, nobody is going to sit back and make kind of nice noises about Mao, terrible, brutal tyrant. But you have to see the worldview of the people who are opposing you. You have to understand that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
even now.
especially when their progenies, their successive generations become very rich and influential in the world. Because this is the other thing that we've got to remember is, you know, even in as recently as the 80s and the 90s, some listeners will remember those decades very clearly. That
Yeah.
they'd already been at school or adults. It's not that long ago.
No.
The disparity between Western world power and other powers was vast. The
Mm.
idea when I was growing up that India could be spoken of as, the world's third largest economy with great prospects. Yes, I know its GDP per capita is very, very, very low, and living standards do not compare to Switzerland or Canada or the US. But as a macroeconomic prospect, India is in a transformed position
Yeah.
compared to 30, 40 years ago, let alone to 80 years ago when it was, shaking off the shackles of British colonial rule. And I just think that in the West, we've got to start to get out of the habit of thinking that other perspectives are somehow being disloyal to our own perspectives. And
Mm.
there's a great sense. I think a great example you gave with Mao, certainly because I've been in Southeast Asia for these last 4 years largely. I've learned so much more than I ever knew about the different communist movements, whether in Indonesia, obviously Vietnam, as you mentioned, Malaysia, so on and so forth. Those fears of China exporting revolution around this region.
Mm.
Exactly right, as you said, the domino theory was the precursor rationale to US involvement full scale in Vietnam. It was we have to stop them here, or else the whole thing will collapse. And so every era has its formulas, its theories, everything else. But all of that was happening in the Cold War when China was not long under communist rule, 1949, and it was primarily an agrarian economy. It's been an agrarian economy until relatively recently.
Yeah.
And the Soviet Union, the other grand adversary, was this kind of imperialistic, industrialized behemoth that was sort of saddled with a horrifically undynamic economy. And no one could accuse China today of being saddled with an undynamic economy. There's plenty of bleak prognoses about why China's economy will fail. And I do actually analyze those because I think some of those ways of analyzing China's prospects in the West, whether it's Western newspapers or Western writers even, are actually conveying the status anxiety, which is China's economy cannot really succeed, aging population, or the rest of it, because we can't imagine it could succeed. We
Yeah.
can't imagine they'd be equivalents and peers because we have literally no frame of reference
Yeah.
of speaking at an equal level to people whose political system we can't stand.
Yeah.
Which, and by the way, that last clause I don't disagree with about the odious aspects of one party rule and authoritarianism. I'm not being an apologist for it, but I do wonder, again, the point of the book is if the world of the next 30, 40 years, many of us will live to see this, our kids will definitely live to see this. the global commons is of a transformed nature.
Mm.
The things like being quite critical and sneering of other people's political systems because you can't stand them, the context in which that sneering occurs will be very, very different indeed.
Yeah. I mean, I think a great snapshot at the moment about the kind of the challenge to I'm not going to call them values, but the challenge to kind of Western priorities and the kind of inability of Western leaders to see things from a non-Western perspective is the international support for the people of Gaza. When you look at what African countries think, and if you look at what Southeast Asian countries think, and other countries in in this idea of the global South, and how they're voting at the United Nations and what popular support, ordinary people on the streets of kind of Nairobi are thinking on the subject, it is wildly different from the worldview of most Western leaders.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this. Just you mentioned Nairobi in passing. That's where my mother was born, actually. So uh, I've actually spent an accumulated year of my life going to visit grandparents in Nairobi. And again, it's that diversity of perspective, and only when you travel, and potentially only when you have links to other countries outside of the West, do you really get a sense of what people feel about issues and why people feel differently about issues, why they instinctively tend towards certain conclusions rather than others, why, a historical reference point, which is so obvious to me as a Londoner, of the Holocaust and the suffering that Jews endured, they're unimaginable. I've been to see Auschwitz while traveling through Poland. I've been to some of the camps in former East Germany as well to see them. And I had Nazi Germany as a staple of my education at school and degree level in the UK. But I grew up in the UK. And it's not that is being denied as an event around the world. It's just, it's not at the tip of the tongue. It's not the base parable for moralized suffering and justice and injustice for others. So you're already starting with different versions of history held by others and held genuinely, not because people are sadistic or necessarily anti-Semitic. And that's one of the difficulties with this horrible debate since the 7th of October. But specifically on 7th of October and the Hamas atrocities against Israel, I was finishing up the last drafts of the book. The book, of course, is out, July 2024. And there was time to incorporate some of this into the book, and I was glad to do so because it's such an important illustrative case where the divergences between Western governments and so-called global South governments is so stark. The accusations of hypocrisy towards those Western governments that have continued to support Israel militarily are so biting. And critically, even if the case goes nowhere, the fact South Africa raised a case at the International Court of Justice, which, by the way, is located in The Hague and is an absolute pillar of the so-called Western rules-based international order. The countries you can count that have actually given their verbal support or written support from foreign ministries and presidents and prime ministers like Malaysia, the Arab League. There's quite a few countries around the world and organizations that represent other countries that have said, well done, South Africa, we support this case. See, there is totally deadlocked. There's no resolution from this, but the nature of this dispute at a global level, and I'm not taking a view on the actual issue in Israel and the Palestinian territories. That is the most bitterly bifurcating issue that we, I think, have in the world today, even more so than Ukraine and Russia. It is the one that will make people bitterly impassioned. But the way the Western governments have ended up being placed on this issue is, I think, a foretaste of the way Western governments could become increasingly isolated by taking what they think are quite genuinely justifiable, defensible positions on international crises or issues that make sense to them, but that many, if not everybody else, many other people, if not everybody else, actually takes a contending position. And that is a reflection of, and I have a chapter on moral power. That's a reflection on how moral power can change when you cannot necessarily control or dominate global debates.
Well, I think this is a really good point, and
which I think is a trend we'll see.
I was going to say, I think moral power is something, and that could be incorporated into this idea of soft power, I suppose. But it's something that is hugely overlooked, and I think the great disaster for Western moral leadership was probably the post 9/11 era, when you have Western, the America under Bush and Cheney saying, "Well, we will be torturing people, yes, but we'll just call it a different word." And there will essentially be a kind of detention without trial and people flown to black sites around the world in CIA planes and all this kind of stuff. A key part of the story that the post-war Western world was built on starts to crumble. The idea that after 1945 we built a world on human rights in order specifically so that we can show a moral difference between the Soviet Union and also that we don't repeat the horrors of Nazism. And this lesson by the time you get the kind of like the neocons in power in America, this is seen as kind of preposterous old hat by them, I think. And I think that in terms of damage to the idea of the West, that must have been quite immense, really.
Yeah, I'm just going to very quickly name check a book by a friend and colleague of mine. It's called The False Promise of Liberal Order by Patrick Porter, which is a very good sort of academic. He's a lecturer at Birmingham University. It's a very good intellectual exploration of precisely what you've just explained, which is to defend this liberal world order, which is how the US and its allies have sometimes described it, has required the use of deeply immoral tactics uh, at certain times. Often they happen in the shadows, because no world order can be perpetuated without some degree of coercive force at some points in some circumstances. Now, that's not a justification, but it is an important point, which is the problem the West has is the gap between its rhetorical presentation of its world ordering project and its world ordering contributions and some of the bitter realities that actually ensue, because the West is not at all immune from poor leadership at times. Everyone's, of course, watching the US election with this very big question in mind. Humans are fallible. There's nothing superior about Westerners. The Western political systems can produce poor leaders and good leaders, just like the Roman Empire did. Some emperors were wise and expanded Roman power responsibly. Others overreached. Look at even Germany. Otto von Bismarck, had he lived to 200 years of age and we didn't have Wilhelm II taking over, let alone Adolf Hitler, would we still say the same about Germany in the 20th century? Responsible, irresponsible leadership, moral, immoral leadership. It goes in cycles. The West has had many, many instances where its own hot foreign policies and activities have produced unquestionably immoral outcomes. And clearly the US war in Vietnam, for a different generation, is that parable.
Mm-hmm.
But it then does many wonderful things as well. And, the West presiding, and especially the Americans presiding over the spread of democratic liberal norms into Eastern Europe after decades of impoverishment under the Soviet yoke has to be juxtaposed with this. And so, I just do not think you can be a sensible intellectual citizen of the world and not take a balanced view over the good and the bad. I'm not at all interested in a one-sided polemical castigation of the West.
No.
But what I would say is that any dominant power is going to have a very mixed record. But I think the key message is, how does that mix globally? Because they play out differently when the West is the most dominant power. You can somehow cover up and move beyond more quickly and more convincingly a bad patch. When power is spread more evenly between the different regions of the world, then I think your room for making these errors starts to drop a bit.
I guess my question is, can the West survive without its moral power in the way that, I don't know, more despotic regimes or more overtly despotic regimes appear to?
Good question. So the West's moralizing is one of its dominant characteristics, and every country is different. That's play differently. And the Netherlands or Switzerland as it does to the US or the UK, clearly. But what's very interesting is that this impetus, which actually is rooted in Christianity, because obviously the West, it doesn't self-identify as this Christian club anymore, but its origins are in old Christendom.
Hmm.
That is just a historical fact. And there's I'm able to trace in the book, using some very good scholars. Tom Holland wrote a book called Dominion a
Oh,
few
yeah.
years ago, which is about the influence of Christianity on the West's norms, and many things in the West we take for granted today we don't associate with Christianity, but do have a root in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the parable of the sacrifice of Christ. Everything that we know about human rights probably has in the West has some tracing back to Christianity. But what's very interesting is that there are some distinctions between how moralizing has evolved in all Christian countries, or Chinese Cynic civilization, how it's evolved in Hindu-dominated India, how it's evolved in Islam, and how it's evolved in all sorts of different contexts. And people tend to, historians and international relations theorists, when they look at this, they tend to think of a more proselytizing strain in the Western moralizing canon than they do in others. There is a sense, and this is a contestable point, which I don't want to go into too much detail over, but you'll have your own views on this. An interesting history of wanting to convert others to a more moral future. And in the past, the Western missionaries did that. In the modern age, those pushing for secular, liberal, democratic, capitalist outcomes, whether they're in the IMF or whether they were like me in my early 20s as an election observer, going to different parts of the world, helping to observe elections to see if they were free and fair as per Western standards. There is this desire to spread what you have, what you think is morally
Yeah.
correct elsewhere. By the way, and I'm speaking very neutrally about that because I don't think that's a bad thing. I think one of the reasons many Western countries are actually quite nice places to live for a lot of people, especially people who are minorities or have their rights protected in some way, shape, or form, is because there is a moral apparatus that you can draw upon in politics and law, in the
Yeah.
media, that people are rightly criticized for ridiculing those who are different to them. You won't have those protections in Russia. You won't have them in China. So, do not think for a second that, when you write a book called Westlessness, you're cheering and saying this is a great thing. All you're trying to do, Nick, is you're trying to say that the position and the comfort level that you might have had in the West, collectively and in individual Western countries, to actually talk about your standards as the universally aspirational norm, that space is shifting and shifting very quickly.
Fantastic. Well, Samir, there we must finish. But it will be a pleasure to invite you back because there's so much more to unpack. I just want to tell all non-UK listeners, Samir name check Tom Holland. That is not, in fact, Spider-Man. There is a UK historian, Tom Holland. Though, so yeah, just to kind of clarify that. So Westlessness available in all good bookshops at the moment.
Yeah, well, by the way, I'm so out of date. I thought Spider-Man was still Tobey Maguire, but you've totally updated
Oh my goodness! Oh
my
my
knowledge
goodness!
here.
No.
Yeah.
You've got about 25 movies to watch to get up to speed. So yeah.
Oh yeah. So bookshops, yes. Because Rishi Sunak called a snap election on the same day my book was supposed to come out, we moved the publication date to the 25th of July, 2024, and it will be available in print in the USA a bit later on. So if you're in the US and you're very keen to get hold of it, and I really hope you are, the audio book that I've narrated and the Kindle edition, you'll almost certainly be able to find on one of the other Amazons around the world. Australia, I think, has probably got hold of it just now, I think, because I think they were still being delivered for the 4th of July. But listen, the book will be out there and you'll be able to get hold of it from July 2024.
Fantastic, brilliant. And remember, go to your independent retailer, please, if you can. So we'll finish there. Thanks so much, Samir, and hopefully we'll catch up soon. All the best.
Nick, it's been a real pleasure. Just drop me an email when the podcast